Old Hollywood didn't just sell love stories, it sold illusions. Behind the glittering smiles, the reality was brutal, ruthless, and calculated. In an era of morality clauses, ironclad contracts, and careers destroyed by a single rumor, marriage was as much a weapon as a shield. Today, we're tearing into unions often labeled lavender marriages, cutting through the spin to expose the cold, hard facts. Barbara, they say this is a second honeymoon for your birth. What's your take? Well, it's the first one we never had. We were too busy working when we got married. Rock Hudson and Phyllis Gates, 1955 to 1958. Hudson's marriage to Phyllis Gates is a textbook case of studio image control. By 1955, Hudson was Hollywood's prized romantic lead, carefully polished to perfection. He wed Gates, his agent's former secretary, in Santa Barbara, California, and took a short honeymoon in Jamaica. A brief show for the press. The marriage collapsed fast. By 1957, Gates says Hudson had left her to fight illness alone while filming in Italy. She filed for divorce in 1958 citing mental cruelty. Hudson didn't contest it. Reports and later accounts paint the same picture. Emotional distance, long absences, and relentless image management. Rudolph Valentino and Jean Aker, 1919 to 1922. Valentino's first marriage is a silent-era mess. He married Jean Aker on November 6, 1919, and the stories of her locking him out on the wedding night persist. They separated almost instantly, never built a real domestic life, and the divorce dragged through the early 1920s. Aker moved in social circles where same-sex relationships existed privately long before the public could see them. This is why the marriage is seen as Hollywood's pressure cooker. Image versus reality in collision. Alla Nazimova and Charles Bryant, 1912 to 1925. Nazimova's marriage to Charles Bryant was a public stunt to protect her career. She kept her first marriage secret and presented Bryant as her husband from 1912. They worked together, paraded as a couple, but it all blew up in November 1925 when Bryant remarried, claiming he was single. Press exposure destroyed Nazimova's carefully curated image, wrecking her reputation and finances. Niels Aster and Vivien Duncan, 1930 to 1932. Swedish actor Niels Aster, often dubbed the male Greta Garbo by the press, entered a highly publicized marriage with vaudeville performer Vivien Duncan in Reno, Nevada, on August 1, 1930. The wedding was reported almost instantly, and the attention was intense from the start. What followed was not a quiet domestic life but a volatile, stormy relationship that unraveled almost as quickly as it was announced. The press framed the union as glamorous, but behind the scenes it was chaotic and unstable. The couple had one daughter, Evelyn Rosetta Duncan Aster, born January 29, 1931, in Bavaria, a detail that further fueled speculation and tabloid interest. By 1932, the marriage had officially ended in divorce. Later biographers argue that the speed, publicity, and breakdown of this marriage make it a clear example of how Hollywood image-making collided with private reality, leaving little room for personal truth. Janet Gainor and Adrien, 1939 to 1959. Janet Gainor's marriage to legendary costume designer Adrien, also known as Adrien Gilbert or Adrian Greenberg, stands out as an anomaly in discussions of lavender marriages because it endured for 2 decades. Married on August 14, 1939, they maintained a stable and outwardly conventional life in an industry defined by facade relationships. They had one son, Robin, born in 1940, and presented a respectable public image that aligned perfectly with studio expectations. Within the film community, Adrien's sexuality was often discussed quietly, while Gainor's personal life has remained largely interpreted through rumor rather than documented fact. What matters most is longevity. The marriage functioned. Biographers frequently describe it as built on mutual understanding, privacy, and companionship rather than romance, showing that some unconventional unions provided real emotional stability behind closed doors. Marlene Dietrich and Rudolph Sieber, 1923 to 1976. Marlene Dietrich married Rudolph Sieber on May 17, 1923, and remained legally married to him for more than 50 years. This was not a traditional marriage by any romantic standard. Dietrich's relationships with both men and women are well documented, and biographers consistently note that Sieber was aware of far more than the public ever suspected. Rather than attempting to maintain a shared domestic life, the couple lived largely separate lives, connected by legality, loyalty, and mutual respect. Their daughter, Maria Elizabeth Sieber, later known as Maria Riva, was born on December 13, 1924. The endurance of the marriage highlights how some Hollywood-era unions functioned less as romantic partnerships and more as pragmatic, long-term agreements shaped around personal freedom and public necessity. Cole Porter and Linda Lee Thomas, 1919 to 1954. Cole Porter married Linda Lee Thomas in Paris in December 1919, remaining married until her death in 1954. Within elite social circles, Porter's sexuality was widely understood, and many biographers argue that Linda entered the marriage fully aware of this reality. Their relationship was not structured around a traditional romantic narrative, but around companionship, loyalty, and deep emotional support. This bond became especially visible after Porter's catastrophic horseback accident in 1937, which left him in chronic pain for the rest of his life. Linda devoted herself to his care, reinforcing that the partnership was genuine, even if it defied Hollywood's preferred fairy tale image. In discussions of Lavender marriages, this union is often cited as one of the most functional and honest arrangements of its kind. Angela Lansbury and Richard Cromwell, 1945 to 1946. Angela Lansbury married actor Richard Cromwell on September 27, 1945, when she was just 19 years old. The marriage collapsed in less than a year, ending in divorce on September 11, 1946. Decades later, Lansbury spoke openly about the relationship, stating that Cromwell was gay and framing the marriage as a youthful mistake shaped by limited understanding and intense social pressure. She did not portray it as a calculated attempt to deceive audiences, but rather as a product of the rigid expectations placed on young stars in mid-century Hollywood, where marriage was seen as a corrective measure rather than a personal choice. Raymond Burr and Isabella Ward, 1948 to 1952. Raymond Burr married actress Isabella Ward on January 10, 1948, but the marriage deteriorated almost immediately. Contemporary accounts and later recollections describe a relationship that failed to establish any real domestic stability, with emotional distance apparent within months. Ward eventually returned to her home state of Delaware, effectively ending the marriage long before it was legally dissolved. The divorce was finalized in 1952, closing a union that had existed more on paper than in practice. After Burr's death, his long-term partnership with Robert Benvitz became widely documented, forcing historians and biographers to reassess the role the marriage played in Burr's life. Rather than a romantic bond, the marriage is often interpreted as a socially protective arrangement, one shaped by a rigid industry that demanded heterosexual conformity and punished deviation without mercy. Charles Lton and Elsa Lchester, 1929 to 1962. Charles Lton and Elsa Lchester married in 1929 and remained together until Lton's death in 1962, a longevity that complicates any simplistic reading of their relationship. Their marriage defies easy categorization, sitting somewhere between companionship, necessity, and public partnership. Biographers and memoirists have offered conflicting interpretations of Lton's sexuality and how it factored into the dynamics of the marriage. Elsa Lchester later wrote candidly about loneliness, emotional strain, and the private challenges she endured behind the public image of stability. Despite these struggles, the couple maintained a united front in public and supported one another professionally for decades. The endurance of the marriage suggests it served multiple functions at once: emotional survival, career stability, and the preservation of public legitimacy in an unforgiving industry. Johnny Ray and Marilyn Morrison, 1952 to 1954. Johnny Ray married Marilyn Morrison in 1952 at the height of his fame, and the wedding quickly became a major media event, complete with prominent newspaper coverage and public fascination. At the time, Ray was one of the most visible and scrutinized performers in America. The marriage, however, lasted barely 2 years, ending in divorce in 1954. Behind the scenes, Ray's private life was under intense moral and legal scrutiny, including a 1951 arrest that preceded his meteoric rise. Biographers often frame the marriage as a strategic attempt to stabilize Ray's public image in a deeply punitive cultural climate, one where suspicion alone could derail a career. The relationship is rarely described as emotionally grounded, instead reflecting the pressures placed on stars to project respectability at any cost. Robert Reed and Marilyn Rosenberger, 1954 to 1959. Robert Reed married Marilyn Rosenberger in July 1954, and the couple had one daughter before divorcing in 1959. On the surface, the marriage fit the post-war ideal: a rising actor, a wife, and a child. After Reed's death in 1992, however, biographies and testimony from close associates revealed his deep internal conflict surrounding his sexuality during a period when public knowledge could end a career overnight. Marriage is often portrayed as Reed's attempt to conform to expectations and construct a normal life that would offer both social acceptance and professional security. Rather than resolving that conflict, the marriage underscores the psychological toll exacted by a system that left little room for honesty or self-definition. Barbara Stanwyck and Robert Taylor, 1939 to 1951. Barbara Stanwyck married Robert Taylor on May 14, 1939, and the marriage ended in divorce in February 1951 after years of strain. This union remains one of the most debated cases in discussions of Lavender marriages. Some historians argue that MGM benefited from the optics of pairing two major stars and actively shaped the public narrative around the relationship. Others point to genuine affection complicated by long separations during World War II, political differences, and personal incompatibility. Because documentation is incomplete and interpretations vary, the evidence remains inconclusive. As a result, the marriage is best treated as contested rather than confirmed, illustrating how Hollywood mythology can blur the line between fact, rumor, and retrospective assumption. When you hear the term Lavender marriage, don't think of gossip or scandal headlines. Think of survival. Think of an industry where a whisper could end a career, where studios sold perfection like a manufactured product, and where respectability was negotiated like a legal contract. This was Hollywood's reality.